Good evening, everyone. You're in the right place at the right time. This is Coast to Coast AM, blasting out of the Mojave Desert like a Scirocco, blazing across the land, slamming into your radio like a supercharged nanoparticle of unobtainium. Greetings from the boldest, bawdiest, most outrageous city in the world, my not-so-humble hometown, Las Vegas, Nevada. My name is George Knapp, your occasional host and moderator of tonight's upcoming cacophonous cavalcade of conversation. What's shaking out there? I am abbreviating our usual opening chatter for a reason that will become obvious pretty quickly. Our first guest tonight is one of the most successful singer-songwriters in the history of popular music, John Fogerty. We mentioned him last week after the news broke about Fogerty regaining legal control of his musical legacy, the songs he wrote, recorded, produced half a century ago, back during the heyday of the juggernaut that was Creedence Clearwater Revival. John joins us momentarily to tell us how he and his wife Julie did it, how he lost control of them in the first place, and a chat about his life in music, current projects, collaborations over the years with other iconic artists, songs he's written, and a lot more. Also, to take a few questions from Coast listeners later tonight. Really looking forward to this and hope you are too. In the second half tonight, our announced guest, Nick Redfern, ran into some trouble with his phone and internet service, so we're going to reschedule him for another time. But we have a cool other guest lined up. J.M. DeBord wrote a fascinating book about nightmares, seems to have figured out how to interpret those weird and dark dreams that we all have from time to time. That's coming up 2 hours from now. You might want to write down some questions to ask him about your own nightmares and what they might mean. We have our usual assortment of items and oddities culled from media sources around the world. It's called Knapp's News, and you can find it on the Coast to Coast AM website. We'll talk about some of those stories and news items a bit later tonight, but for now, bring in the dog and the cat and the family hoodoo, put on a pot of joe, slide your bod into those warm winter jammies and your toes into your best bunny slippers, plop yourself down in a comfy spot, turn down the lights, and turn up the radio, because we're about ready to rumble, heading out into the bayou, into the swamp, into the habitat of gators and snakes and Spanish moss. Singer, songwriter, icon John Fogerty joins us live next. I'm George Knapp, and this is Coast to Coast AM. I remember as plain as day the first time I heard a Creedence song. It was sometime in 1968. I was getting a ride to school, and onto the car radio came these somewhat ominous drum beats. Sounded like they were way far off in the distance, getting a little louder each time. And then the guitar notes came in. They sounded a little bit dangerous. And then this voice comes howling out of what sounded like a swamp. My friend and I looked at each other, and the expression was the same. What the heck is that? Turns out it was a song called Susie Q, much different from the version recorded a decade earlier that I'd never heard anyway. The DJ said it was a new band from the Bay Area with an improbable name, Creedence Clearwater Revival. Later, I went out and bought that album on vinyl, wore it out. Our whole family played it. We did the same with CCR's next album and the ones that followed. Through 8-track tapes, through the cassettes era, through CDs, and then back to vinyl again. That band basically conquered the music world. Between 1969 and 1971, Creedence had 14 consecutive top 10 hits and 5 consecutive top 10 albums in the U.S., 2 of which went to number 1. They were the first major act to be signed to appear at a little music event called Woodstock, and in 1969 they sold more records than the Beatles. John Fogerty emerged as the leader of that band, its lead singer, lead guitarist, principal songwriter, and producer of their recordings. After the band broke up, he went on to a highly successful solo career, but was stripped of ownership of his own songs. 50 years later, as of last week, he got his songs back. That news was covered all over the world, and if you follow John Fogerty on social media, you probably saw video clips and photos of him just beaming a great big smile, which is what I'm doing right now. John, welcome back to Coast to Coast.
Well, thank you so much. Hi, George. How you doing?
Good. Congratulations on getting your songs back. Let's start there. Tell us, how did you pull it off? I mean, after so many years, seems like the odds were pretty steep.
Well, I guess they were valuable enough that people didn't want to let go of them, that's for sure. Well, to try and tell it in a simple way, in the U.S., at least, under U.S. copyright law, my songs the songs from the Creedence era were going to revert back to me after waiting 56 years on each song, depending on when that song had been filed in the first place, way back in the 60s. So it was going to slowly happen, but I would only get them back in the United States. The rest of the world would still be owned by the company that was originally Fantasy Records. And so, I've waited a long time, my whole life, basically. Here's where the story gets much better and my favorite part, because this is where I get to talk about my wonderful wife, Julie. She began to sense, I don't know, a few years ago, well, gee, why do we want to wait so long? Why don't we figure out a way to try and get them back now? And that's kind of, to make it simple, that's kind of what she helped engineer. She was told no a few times, but she doesn't take no for an answer. And eventually a plan was figured out to where instead of just having only the U.S. rights revert back to me, she, along with some special people that we know and also some attorneys, figured out a plan whereby I have purchased the majority stake in my songs all over the world, the global rights, in other words, that will now remain with me and my family for, eternity, as they say.
That's just awesome. I've seen these videos that you posted on Twitter and elsewhere of you sitting around. It's like a birthday party and confetti is raining and the big grin on your face. That's really genuine. I mean, you are genuinely happy about this after so long.
Oh, yes. You mentioned in your little prenup or whatever you call it.
Intro, sure.
Yeah, that I had given my songs away. But to be more correct, the original contract that we signed, and at that point, I hadn't written Proud Mary or any of the other songs that became what you call Creedence songs. When we all signed that contract in January of 1968, part of that contract also took ownership of any future songs I would write. So I had signed away the rights to songs that didn't even exist yet. And that was sort of the quicksand, mucky murk that I found myself in as of 1969, 1970.
It's astonishing. You tell the story in great detail in your book, A Fortunate Son. We can't cover it all, but basically describe the quagmire that you got yourself into. This particular executive that you even wrote songs about later, they tied you up even after you left Creedence. You owed them something like 8 albums before you'd be free?
It was a lot more than that, actually. Yes, we were all young and naive, as youngsters are, and we'd signed this contract. Eventually, after about 4 years, the band broke up. That's a whole nother story that, it's a sad thing. I think I can only say that had we had a more adult figure, some people would call that a manager, or someone, that we could all sort of confide in, perhaps we would have figured out a way to get over all the bumps and stay together. But it didn't work out that way. Anyhow, the band broke up. The label quickly let the other 3 members of Creedence out of their contract. But I found to my horror that they owned me still, even though the band had broken up. They still owned me as an individual, and I was going to be responsible for something like 180, 85, something like that, tracks, recorded songs, in other words. And I looked at all that and figured it would probably take me 20 years or more to fulfill that obligation. I was fit to be tied. My mental condition was not too good, that's for sure.
I read in your book about you produced an album. You gave them an album. They said, well, this one doesn't count. These are country songs, not rock songs. Is that right?
Yeah, the first thing I recorded after Creedence broke up was an album called The Blue Ridge Rangers. And I had sort of hit a brick wall and my brain was exploding, and somehow the usual ease with which I had written all those songs, like Proud Mary and Bad Moon Rising and on, suddenly was really difficult. So I came up with the idea of recording a lot of the songs that, that I had grown up listening to and loving, as a way of sort of, I don't know, getting the wheels turning again, getting things moving. And so I spent quite a bit of time on that. I played all the instruments. These were great old songs I loved, like Jambalaya, country songs, of course. Today I started Loving You Again, a wonderful Merle Haggard song. Anyway, I got all done and turned it in, and they told me that it didn't count against my obligation.
Oh, man.
And that was just one more punch in the gut. And I realized, well, they can do that whenever they want. I mean, I might record for the next 10 years and they'll keep saying, well, this doesn't count. We'll put it out, but it doesn't count. It was a pretty bad place to be.
As you said, if you'd had a manager, if you'd had, say, Brian Epstein or someone like him, that would have made the difference. But what you got instead was like a guy like Alan Klein, right?
Well, Alan Klein actually did show up in the last days of Creedence. He came and visited us in our headquarters. At the time, what he did was he took a copy of the contract. He went away for a day or two. And we were hoping he could find a way to break the contract so that we could start actually enjoying some of the fruits of our labor. He came back after a couple of days and told us there was nothing he could do about it. It was ironclad. The interesting thing about all of that, as I pointed out in the book, I mean, Alan Klein turned out to be not a very artist-friendly person. He was, no. I think he started out as an accountant, actually, not a lawyer. But, there's, I point out the history of him. He visited the Beatles, and they broke up. He visited the Rolling Stones, and as far as I'm concerned, they broke up, but eventually they got back together. He visited the Kinks, and they broke up. Then he visited Creedence Clearwater Revival, and they broke up. It's a pretty storied resume to have, on your vest.
You guys started, it's like kids in school, let's start a band. You started as the Blue Velvets, then it was the Gollywogs, a name you weren't too crazy about, and then that era came along where it was all this creative explosion of music and creative names, Jefferson Airplane, Buffalo Springfield, Nitty Gritty Dirt Band, Creedence Clearwater Revival comes along. I have heard people grumble because you and your brother Tom and your bandmates didn't grow up like in the Okefenokee swamp. You didn't really live in the bayou. You weren't out there catching and eating crawdads. You're just a bunch of kids from Northern California, as if you don't have the right to write that kind of music, swamp rock, roots rock. To me, it's like saying that those great British invasion-era blues guitarists, Eric Clapton and the like, shouldn't record stuff because they didn't grow up in the Mississippi Delta.
Well, yeah, I of course, was a fan of rock and roll growing up, and rhythm and blues as well. And many of the people I loved that made such an impression on me were folks like Howlin Wolf and Bo Diddley, and even Elvis Presley, was from Mississippi. But they became popular artists on the radio. And, of course, as you say, I didn't grow up in the swamp, but my imagination did through those artists, of course. I mean, it really made a big impression. But more importantly, those artists were really great. They had a lot to say with their words and imagery, and also the music was wonderful, and it just captured my imagination. So in a lot of ways, that those were my music lessons.
Well, in that era, where other bands were going into psychedelic stuff, really wild sounds, you established what is now known as roots rock. I mean, that's the start of it. Country-tinged rock and roll, a lot of blues stuff. I mean, it was almost counterintuitive at the time, or do you not see it that way?
I think I had a lifelong love of a certain kind of music, but I have to admit, you veer off into other things that are on the radio. Bands would come along, or some of the girl groups like the Chiffons, things like that. You end up liking those. But there came a time, actually it happened while I was on active duty in the Army, marching around of course, this is the Vietnam era, and you're marching around on a huge parade field that's asphalt, and it's in the south, and the sun's beating down. It's about, I think, coming off the asphalt is probably 130 or 140 degrees. It's really hot. And I began to actually look forward to that part of the day because I would hallucinate. I didn't know that what I was doing, but I would go off into this place in my mind and, just follow the guy in front of me marching. But my imagination was starting to drift, and I began working on some words and stories, the first of which became the song Porterville, as recorded. Well, it was released by the Gollywogs, and then eventually it was on the same recording was on the first Creedence album. And that was my first sort of story song, where I actually was telling something that, to me, at least resonated a lot more than what I'd been doing before. Was pretty much, the simple rock and roll sort of song where you're just rhyming words and seemingly writing a love song, but it's just sort of an exercise in rhyming moon and June and, all that, Betty Lou, put me down, I feel so blue, all that stuff. Because people, not only do you like that, but people are telling you that's what you got to record if you want to be successful. And at some point, this story thing became much more interesting to me, and I realized I was developing, I was evolving. And at that point, that's when I decided to kind of concentrate on the music that I really thought was at my core, meaning blues and rhythm and blues and sort of the swampier aspects of rock and roll, rather than sort of the lighter stuff that, was very successful, but it didn't seem to be me.
The explosion in popularity, what a ride that must have been for these young men, you and the other three bandmates. It was so over the top, so huge all of a sudden, and then it kept going on and on, hit after hit. And I've seen it written where other artists at the time would complain, well, all these guys do is write hits, as if that's not what they want to do, write hits.
Well, it was an amazing time, certainly. You're terrified. George, also, I quickly assumed after Proud Mary that I had opened the door, you might say, and discovered the room where I could create. Up until that time, we had all talked about, well, we're all going to write songs and we're all going to arrange music and that sort of thing. Even though we hadn't really done that for the first 10 years of our career, I had always been the musical director. At some point, my brother Tom was writing songs, much in the vein, by the way, that I was just describing, the sort of sweet rock and roll rhyming songs that were, so called upon in the early days of rock and roll. And I had, after Proud Mary, which sort of just kind of happened one magical day, and I realized right then, right as I sat there writing it, that it was a classic, that it was far greater than anything I had ever done before. But, of course, I had my idols, Lennon and McCartney and folks like Irving Berlin or Hoagy Carmichael or some of the other great rock and roll writers, Lieber and Stoller. And I idolized their music and their records and their songs, and I realized I had finally written something that belonged in that category, and that scared me to death, because the next time I had to go into that room and sit in front of a blank piece of paper, you're wondering if you can do it. Happily, after twists and turns in my mind, I wrote another one. I wrote a song called Born on the Bayou. And then out came Lodi and Bad Moon Rising, and I realized somehow I had discovered and figured out what worked for me, and it seemed to be working out there in the public. So I began to sort of fan the flames that were burning so brightly right there.
Well, we're going to get into what it's like to be in the zone as you were in that time period and probably still are to some degree, talking with the one and only John Fogerty. We go into the break with a Creedence classic, one of my favorites, kind of a John Steinbeck flavor to this, Lodi. There is an early John Fogerty classic, Tombstone Shadow. There is, of course, a story behind that song, what inspired that song idea. We're going to get into that, what led to some of the classics that you know and love, and we'll cover a lot more ground here with my guest, John Fogerty, right after this on Coast to Coast AM. John, we're talking about this explosion of fame that overcame you guys. I can imagine what it was like for young men to suddenly become world famous. Coming out of order here to ask this question, but you've been world famous for most of your adult life, more than half a century. Can you go out and have dinner? Can you go out to have an evening with your wife without getting hassled or mobbed?
Oh, you bet.
Do you wear disguises?
It depends on the place and the time, I think, and the context. By the way, I love going out with my wife on date night that we still try to do once a week at least. When the kids were younger, we needed that time to be able to talk to each other that involved, two adults rather than just talking about kids' problems. But yeah, it depends on the situation. I mean, I'm surprised sometimes that I find out later, even though I thought I was incognito, that, there's people over there had been knowing who I was the whole time. Because I tend to like to be, as normal as I can. But if I walk through a venue or a neighborhood that's near a place where I'm playing, obviously there's going to be a connection right away.
Yeah. I'm just going back to what I was hinting about before is there's a reference to it in your book, too, Fortunate Son, about hit after hit after hit happens. And suddenly there's grumbling, and it gets back to you. Grumbling from your fellow artists. Well, sure, they can produce hits, but what we're doing is art, as if those artists don't want hits, don't want people to listen to their songs. It seems silly.
I think the way I would respond, remember, I was just a normal rock and roll kid that grew up through Elvis and Little Richard and then the Beatles. And, the Beatles were incredibly successful and incredibly good, which is still teaching us all. I just looked at it that making a hit song, a hit record, back then rock and roll and pop music were synonymous. Later they divided again the way rock and roll had taken over pop music in the 50s, but pop music went back before that, of course. What I'm trying to say is, being popular was a lot of hard work, and it's the toughest game in town, meaning that, you can have a band and play a bunch of covers or old songs or obscure songs, all that, and, and have a nice little career. But the much harder thing to do is to create a song and a record that becomes very popular. And so, I would hear some of that, as you call it, grumbling, but I never took it seriously. I just figured it's kind of like if you were on a baseball team, except you're hitting 355 and probably 45 home runs every year, that sort of thing. Yeah, there's going to be some grumbling, but that's not going to slow you down.
You're in this band, and one of the band members is your brother. The other two guys are friends of yours, but it ends up where you're writing all the songs. You're the lead singer. You're the lead guitarist. We're going to hear a song later where you're the lead organ player. You're producing it. You're mixing it afterwards. You're doing basically all of it. And that leads to disagreements and trouble and grumbling. And eventually the band breaks up, in effect, because of that, right? In effect?
Well, I'm a little more philosophical about all that now. But I think, number one, as I began to kind of evolve and discover how to do things, it seemed to me that had been what we were searching for all those 10 years before when we were living in obscurity. Now, don't get me wrong, we weren't very good during those years either. It isn't like, somebody missed the ball and we should have been on American Bandstand. No, we were learning. We were getting better as we practiced our instruments and that sort of thing, and our presentation, obviously. But when you're young, you just really don't know what the mystery is. You don't know what the magic formula is. You're trying to learn, and of course, everybody and his brother is telling you what it is. And, some people actually have some insight, and a lot of it is kind of foolish advice, really. But finally, if you're lucky and you start to get somewhere near something that people consider good and it's also popular, well, at least the way I felt was, wow, we're finally here on the right track, and this is how you do it, and this is what we've been searching for. So that was how I looked at it all, that I'd finally gotten on the main highway of, popular music, and the fact that I understood it so well just seemed to be almost like, well, here, fellas, come over here. I found it. Here it is. And I really did not understand the dissension about that. But, people are funny animals. We do curious things.
Well, it's a lot of it boils down to control, too. I mean, when the band has success, you're controlling the musical direction. The others want in on that. And it's probably perfectly understandable that they would. It's not only your brother in the band, he's your older brother, there's an interesting sibling dynamic at work there, wouldn't you say?
Yes, very much. And Tom was very gracious about that in the beginning. When I was really young, maybe 12, 13, and just plunking away at the guitar, well, he was 4 years older than me, and of course moved in different social circles. He would sing with various older people that were rock and roll bands, that sort of thing. And I idolized him. Wow, look at my brother. Look what he gets to do, And as time went on with my little trio that you mentioned, we were called the Blue Velvets. I was evolving and eventually got to where I could sing pretty well and present a pretty good rock and roll song. And there was a point at which Tom realized that my sound was more commercial or stronger or more developed, whatever way you want to say to describe that. And he actually acquiesced. He said, well, John has a sound. We should be using that. And he was content with that for a time. And then I think just the natural human sort of competition takes over, and you want to, everybody wants to be standing up at the front where the spotlight is.
I think at the end, I remember reading that toward the end, the last album, you said, okay, everybody wants a piece of the action. You write 3 songs, I'll write 3 songs, you write 3, and we'll put out an album like that. And it didn't go so well, right?
Well, that was sort of, again, that was, how do you say that? It was out of frustration, I suppose. When I had, as I described, had discovered how to do it and what was working, I also realized pretty much, I had grown up with these guys, and I kind of could gauge what I thought were their natural abilities. And certainly as in songwriting, 2 of the guys had never even written a song before. And so I felt that was a pressure. I felt it as pressure, meaning, now we've got a band that's working. Our sound is working, that we're becoming popular. And there are these forces within the band that want to change that. And to me, it was, can you imagine if your company was Coca-Cola and you're doing very well with your secret formula, Coke, and then somebody at the top decides one day, well, let's just change everything now. We're gonna make lemonade or something, I mean, the other executives, I'm sure, would just go into a tizzy. And that was kind of how I felt, like that it was going to ruin the business, as it were, or at least our style. And I resisted. But at some point, when the voices got loud enough, I realized the only way to keep the band together, because everybody was grumbling so much, I said, okay, everybody will write songs, and we'll go in that direction. I didn't do it like happily or willingly. I mean, I'm not trying to say I'm a big grump, but it was in fear. I didn't really feel that was the right thing we should do, but I was sort of being talked into it, and that is what we did. And as you say, it didn't do very well.
You were inspired by the Beatles, by those songwriters, the singers, and I remember you saying or writing at some point that the Beatles, their success was one of the worst things to happen to your band. How do you mean?
We're right in that subject right now. It's kind of funny. I think at some point back in the day, I said, the Beatles are the worst things that ever happened to my band, Creedence. And what I meant was that, of course, we all saw them on Ed Sullivan, and they even had their name under their face. Ringo, and then it showed John. I think when it showed John, it said, "Sorry, girls, he's married." And it showed
That's right.
Paul,
That's
and
right.
it showed George. So we had instant name recognition right away with the Beatles. Well, as time went on, they all became singing stars, of course. And actually, besides John and Paul, George, of course, showed that he could write a pile of songs that were great. And Ringo even wrote some songs like Octopus's Garden, things like that. And so everybody in the Beatles was remarkably creative in a commercial and artistic way. And I think that certainly that last album kind of, it was something I didn't want to do. I didn't want to show our weakness. I used to make that speech to the band in the early days. We're going to only show our strengths, and we're going to hide our weaknesses. But by the end of the dynamic of the band, what everybody wanted to do was what I felt were our weaknesses, because they wanted to be like the Beatles. And I guess simply we weren't up to the task.
You outsold the Beatles in 1969, which is absolutely astonishing. And there's a film that's been made of that period, that heady period when you just exploded all over the world. This film that came out on Netflix last year, narrated by the great Jeff Bridges. It's about a long-lost concert in London. Did you remember that footage existed out there somewhere?
I remember doing the concert, if that's what you mean.
Yeah.
I knew that there was a film somewhere, and people have haggled over that for years and years. And for one reason or another, it didn't see the light of day until now. Did
you like it? What came out?
Well, number one, I was not involved in the production. That's a whole nother story, George.
Oh man!
If you have time for that, but I wasn't allowed to be involved, is what I'm trying to say, and so it came out without any input from me. And let's see, did I like it? I saw a little bit of it. I actually did not watch the concert itself. I was there. But I watched a little bit of the interviews, if you call it that, of the various members of the band. And I think the first thing I just felt was, well, we're all 22 years old and people are asking us silly questions, and you're getting silly answers like, I don't know, what's your favorite flavor of ice cream or something. And, people are trying to be clever and say something comical or whatever. And it just sort of, well, George, I'm in my 70s, and I see myself looking kind of silly, and you feel a little foolish about it.
I thought it was awesome. I thought it was a great time capsule. It's a terrific encapsulation of what that period was like in your life. I can see that you being shut out of that whole production, you'd have a different view of it, but it was really great. And we have a link on the website if people want to check it out if they haven't seen it. It's and Jeff Bridges, wow, he's awesome.
I've met Jeff a few times, and even played some songs with the dude, of course. What I would like to say is, even though I wasn't involved, the release of that concert sort of coincided with the overtures that Julie was making out in the world to try and get my songs back. The publishing deal that has just exploded into the news the last couple of weeks. And so even though the product, the concert was already finished and all that, I agreed to start doing, I was trying to be a happy camper, you know what I mean? And get along with the label and sort of, can I say, catch up to the train as it had already rolled down the track and be a good soldier. And, you know, because that's how I feel. As we develop this conversation we're having, you'll understand where I'm coming from. It's for the first time in my life, I get to participate in what's going to be done with my music. Of course, this came about after that Albert Hall concert was released. I tried to catch up to that conversation.
There was another concert film that was made, a little place called Woodstock. You were the first major act signed to that momentous musical event, and yet people who've seen the film, they don't remember seeing Creedence there because it was out. And there was another long story in how that came about. But there's now an album out. When I first met you here in Las Vegas, it was on the anniversary, and an album was finally released. Have you yet to listen to that whole album?
No, I haven't listened to the whole thing. I've listened to parts of it, though. Again, I was there, and I remember that we were blistering. You know, we were on our game for sure. But remember, it was 2:30 in the morning, and that's a whole nother story.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great performance. I just listened to it twice today, and but you were on at 2:30 in the morning because the Grateful Dead came on before you and just went on and on and on and never stopped, right?
Well, and many others. I mean, the thing was just running late. Each act kind of ran over, and it started to accumulate, and it got later and later and later, and my real issue with not being in the film Woodstock was they had sent a tape of Bad Moon Rising, and the producers of this film that was going to come in another year or so. And, we played well. It sounded really good and professional and all that. There wasn't much audience reaction because that was not on the tape. And I wondered to myself, gee, a little later in our set, I mean, we were smoking Susie Q and Keep On Chugolin. Again, if there'd been a manager to maybe go back to the producers and say, look, we don't want this 2-minute song. We want this 10, 12-minute version of Susie Q because it's so much more creative.
Yeah.
Perhaps I would have agreed to that, but I wasn't given that choice. And Creedence was on a very fast train, over the moon at that point. And I just thought that, I wouldn't be disappointed. I didn't want to show a weakness. I just felt it was better that we sidestep the movie.
Talking with John Fogerty about his amazing career. We go into the break with a song he sang with Bob Seger for an album called we'll talk about that album a little bit later, but you're going to recognize this song. The first time I heard it gave me goosebumps.
That song, Hot Rod Heart, really gets to it. That's from an album called Wrote a Song for Everyone, in which John Fogerty collaborated with some great talents, including in that song, Brad Paisley. Now, Brad Paisley can play the guitar, but John Fogerty dished it out as well as he took it. He didn't blink. We're going to talk about that album and other collaborations with some of the biggest names in music over the years. I think he's worked with just everyone. And then some origins of songs that you know and love. We'll save some time in this hour for some Coast calls as well. We'll be right back. John Fogerty, I want to ask about some of the artists with whom you've collaborated over the years. It's a long, long list. Let's start with that Brad Paisley, that album, Wrote a Song for Everyone, where you pull in some of the best musicians and artists in the world, and you re-record some great songs of yours, starting with that one, Hot Rod Heart. There is a guitar duel in there that is pretty fantastic, and you really hold your own. That guy can play, right?
Oh, Brad is just fabulous. Brad is one of my favorite musicians and certainly favorite people in the whole world. Just a great guy and a great talent, obviously. And, George, I love guitar. I mean, somewhere way back around 11, 12 years old, I just got struck by lightning that was what I was supposed to do. And starting probably with Scotty Moore and Dwayne Eddy and James Burton, just loving people that could really play the guitar. And along the way here, I got introduced to Brad's music, Brad Paisley, and realized that he's just one of the best guitar players in the whole world in any genre. And became a huge fan, and eventually I concocted the idea that I wanted to play a song with him. He was the first guy, when I was talking to him on the phone, he said, well, I picture this as, it's kind of like a duel out on Main Street.
Yeah.
And, except with guitars, right? And I said back to him, or I think later I said, the picture in my mind was, he's Clint Eastwood, and I'm already shot down. And just great. And, trying to keep up with that is just a lot of fun.
Oh, you held your own, more than hold your own. And in fact, I was going to say later in our conversation, I just saw you about 2 months ago here in Las Vegas, and I was blown away because I saw you before the pandemic here, and it was great. I'd never heard you better. And then you got better this time. And I don't want to blow too much smoke, but you're playing these songs that I know so well for so long, and then you add these guitar flourishes that are just terrific. And I guess it's a way to keep the music fresh for you.
That's exactly right. Yeah, I still practice, and I'm still learning, and I still want to get better. I mean, that's that same drive that I had probably when I was 12, 13. There's still a lot of mystery in it for me. I enjoy it so much. I mean, it really is the thing that keeps it all going for me, the fact that you can invent new things and learn new techniques, that sort of thing. There's a world of stuff you can learn. There's no one person has it all down. So that excitement, I just love talking about it and thinking about it and, of course, doing it.
Well, plus you get to, you have your sons, Shane and Tyler, are part of your concerts, and they have really blossomed as musicians as well. You have a guitar duel there on the stage that I saw 2 months ago that was just blistering.
Oh, thank you. You've hit on the whole joy for me now. I mean, getting to be on stage with my family, my kids, and having just that sensation of the absolute love of music and the joy of performing in front of people. It just creates this sort of cloud in the room, this wonderful sort of bubble that rises up out of the audience and myself, and it kind of is it's extra on top of the particular song you're playing. It seems to be sort of a thing, like an orb that rises up, and if you can keep that thing floating with the joy and love of performing, you're really doing your job then.
Well, it really comes across. It's so much fun. I hope you're coming back to Las Vegas sometime this year, and I hope people will come and see you. Back to this album, Wrote a Song for Everyone. The song we played going into the break was with Bob Seger. Seems like you and he are cut from the same cloth in many regards.
Well, I sure admire Bob, and what a voice. And I agree with you that, when he comes in and starts singing, I got goosebumps just now hearing that. I mean, he's just amazing, and he just owned that song. And I sure enjoy hearing them.
Some of the other artists that you've collaborated with, encountered, their stories that you tell in your book. One about Jeff Beck, who recently passed, of course. You were there when he was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I think you've called him the greatest rock guitarist ever. And you, the impression that he made when he gave his speech at that Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, I think stuck in your head.
Well, it's so sad, Jeff's passing. I consider, and I think many people do, that he was the greatest guitar player of them all. And it's not because of, all the big hair, spandex, flashy stuff and all that. It's the soul that you put in to your performance. And, that classical song that he did 2 years ago, I wish I was more up on that sort of music. I can't remember the actual
might be Jeff
title,
Beck's Bolero. Is that Jeff Beck's Bolero,
no.
maybe?
This was an album probably about 10 years ago. It was an actual classical piece.
Oh, yeah.
And he plays guitar, but it sounds a lot like a classical violin, of all things. It's just beautiful, just amazing. I went and saw him and Tyler came with me, and Julie. I think we were in Montreux, and he was performing, and boy, it was just astounding.
You met Jimmy Page and Led Zeppelin there while you were out on tour, maybe Australia, was it? And you hit it off with Jimmy Page?
Yeah, that was true. Back in, I think, 72, Creedence was touring Australia, and I met the guys, and two or three of them, I think. I think Creedence had already played our show, and Zeppelin was going to play the next night, and this was sort of a night in between, and we all stayed up very late, and I'm sure drank too much and told lots of great stories from the old days. It was a lot of fun.
Let's see. How about Alan Jackson? Alan Jackson was also performed on that album, Wrote a Song for Everyone, right?
Yeah, Alan sang Have You Ever Seen the Rain? And Alan has been one of my favorite artists since 1989. In fact, I used to, just as my show was going to begin, I would always play an Alan Jackson song or a track he recorded called Mercury Blues that's just fabulous. George, I really don't make a lot of distinction between the genres of music. If somebody's just a great artist, I just am captivated and love what they do. I've gone to see Alan in concert many times, and I think I had pestered him actually for a while to do a song with me. And I think perhaps he felt it was a little dangerous to be seen with a rock and roller or something like that. But finally, it became okay, and I was over the moon. I mean, that track, the job he does on Have You Ever Seen the Rain, I think is just wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a video clip that I saw about a year ago. I don't think I'd ever heard of this before, but it's from a nightclub in L.A. There's you playing. I think it's George Harrison and Bob Dylan are on stage with you. Is that right?
Yes, I had gone to see Taj Mahal. He was playing at the Palomino, which is a sort of legendary old club that was in the valley of L.A. And lo and behold, I hear this rumor that Bob Dylan is somewhere in the shadows, and so is George Harrison. And, of course, I'm watching Taj Mahal do his show, and suddenly George Harrison's up there on stage with him. And then somebody asked for another guitar and said, well, Bob Dylan's. And so they get up there. And I'm not usually this way. I'm usually kind of shy and retiring. But when I saw that, I actually wanted to get up there with them. I was kind of looking around and go, man, I sure hope they invite me. Maybe I'll have to invite myself. But at some point, I ended up on stage, and it was just wonderful. It's a great memory for sure.
Wow, that could have been an album. That could have been the Traveling Wilburys, pre-Wilbury era.
It was probably a precursor to that. That's the famous incident where I was not performing my Creedence era songs during those years, and so George had done "Honey Don't," and he just blistered it. It was so good. I think Taj Mahal was actually sort of elbowing and encouraging everybody to do something, and Bob Dylan did something, and then somebody turns and said, well, John, why don't you do Proud Mary? And I looked out in the audience, and oh no, I'm not singing those songs. And Bob Dylan turns to me, he's on my left, so he turns towards me to his right, and he says, John, if you don't do Proud Mary, everybody's going to think it's a Tina Turner song. And I'm looking at him, and I'm realizing that my argument about not performing the song is ridiculous in that environment. And so, of course, we did it.
Did you ever meet Tina Turner and perform the song with her? Because it became a big hit for her.
Oh, I loved the Ike and Tina version, of course. And all through the years after that, through the 70s and 80s, while Tina was, running around the world and I was sort of in obscurity, I was so knocked out by that version of Proud Mary. Somewhere around 2000, Tina was touring Europe, and she asked me to join her on that tour. So I got to perform Proud Mary with Tina Turner on stage. I think one of my favorite memories is at Wembley Stadium, and she was doing this kind of, the introduction, her version, they do it really slow. It's the part where she kind of does a dialogue, and then she says, well, we never do anything nice and easy. We do it rough or something like that. And then the band kicks into the fast part, and I'm supposed to make my exit at that point, right? Supposed to take a bow and say, okay, Tina, take it away, right? And as I bow, this is something they didn't warn me about. My head, I bowed at the waist, my head goes down, and about 3 inches from my head, all these pyrotechnics, all these rockets came up out of the stage. They actually singed my hair a little bit. I mean, I could have had my head torn off. Happily, I'm still here, and so it's a great memory instead of something else, an obituary, But that was so much fun. I mean, being out there at Wembley Stadium and all, everybody's holding their lighters up and all that sort of thing. It was great.
I wouldn't ask you about this because you're not supposed to spill any beans, but it came out in Rolling Stone about Dolly Parton working on a rock album, and she brought you back to record something. I don't know how much, if anything, you can say, but I'll bet it was fun working with Dolly Parton.
Absolutely. Yes, we did work together in a studio. We were all sworn to secrecy, and then, I don't know, the next day or the day after that, she sort of was out there in public talking about it. So, I'm as mystified as you about how much I can say. What I really would like to say is what a wonderful person. She's absolutely gracious and warm, and the way I say it, she's normal. You meet a lot of people that are sort of in this business that are sort of full of themselves and all that kind of thing. And
Sure.
she's just great, just down home and nice. And what a trooper. I mean, she works hard at what she's doing, and just the best. One of the best people in showbiz I have ever met.
Is there anyone you'd like to work with but you haven't worked with? Is there any venue you'd like to play that you haven't played?
Wow, what a question, George. Well, there's some that I regret that I didn't get to work with. I wish somehow I'd worked with Ray Charles.
Yeah.
He's one of my favorites all through the years. In that same vein, Otis Redding was at the time when he passed. I mean, he was just on his way, I think, to becoming the king. He was clearly so talented and had this way of sharing his emotions and connecting with an audience. And I just thought he was really on his way. And that was so sad that, the plane crashed, of course.
Right before the Dock of the Bay came out.
Yeah, when that, I didn't know about the song, of course, when it happened. And, it seemed like a few weeks after his passing, Dock of the Bay comes out. And it was clearly the best thing he had done so far. I will say, going back to Try a Little Tenderness, I mean, it's still just one of those recordings that, you wish you had one of those in your own career. I mean, that's just up there on Mount Rushmore. There's 2 or 3 of those in the whole history of music, and that's one of them.
What about Paul McCartney?
I've met Paul, very nice fella, and incredibly talented. Someday I'm going to learn how to play Blackbird. Actually, 2 of my children play Blackbird really well, and it makes me wonder, well, shucks, I ought to finally get that one down. Just a very talented guy, and one of the greatest songwriters ever.
Springsteen.
A dear friend. Bruce is another guy, by the way, that is charmingly humble and sweet. I don't know if he would like me to say that, but he is. Really nice guy, normal, and he's gracious. He's always worried about how you're doing, how you're feeling, are you taken care of, that sort of thing. And, of course, he lights up the sky whenever he gets on a stage, one of my favorites. You asked me about working with somebody. I hope it's still in the cards that we get to do some more things together, because I always enjoy it when we sing a song together.
There's a million songs I'd like to ask you about, but there's only a limited amount of time. So I want to ask you a general question about songwriting. Are you a songwriter? Seems like you really have a work ethic and you sit down and really work at it. Have you ever had songs just pop into your head already written, as some other songwriters say, that they just kind of pluck it out of the ether?
Well, let's see. There's been a few that took a long, long time, but I would say Fortunate Son was one that I had been thinking about. You know, what the subject was about. I'd been thinking about that for a while, and I was showing the music to the band, meaning, you know, getting the bass part right and getting the drums to sound right and getting the rhythm, getting our performance to be up to snuff. Because, you know, we usually had to rehearse things for a while to get them to be what I would call record ready. And usually back in those days, I would record what I thought was going to be a single for 6 weeks. I wanted it to be like you've restrained the race horses, you know, in the corral, doing all that work on the music, getting it right so that there's no question about any of that stuff, that it's ready to go. And then when you drive over and get in the recording studio, it just sort of bursts out of that corral and gets on the tape like in 2 or 3 takes, and you're done. You know, you've already played it for 6 weeks. You know what you're going to do, and now it's just a matter of getting all that energy on tape. And so Fortunate Son was kind of getting ready to percolate. We were probably in the 4th or the 5th week, and I realized, well, we're getting near this. I better go write the song. And I went into my bedroom with one of those yellow tablets, you know, and a pencil, and sat down on the edge of the bed with absolutely nothing. I didn't know any words. I'm not sure that I even knew what it was called. And 20 minutes later, it had all happened. And that's certainly about the fastest that ever came together for me.
Well, it's a great song. We're going to hear it in a second. And it's also one of the most misunderstood and misused. We have politicians who play it all the time thinking it's rah-rah, rah-rah patriotic stuff, and they have no clue what that song is about, right?
I suppose, you know, I guess they're thinking it's a rousing melody or something, but yes, you're absolutely right.
We're talking with John Fogerty about the songwriting process, some of the hits that he's written over the years. I will save some time for questions and calls from our listeners. We go into the break with the song we're just talking about, Fortunate Son. It Came Out of the Sky is just a great song, and it should not be a surprise that we play it here a lot, given the topics that we cover. I've mentioned before, and so has my friend George Norrie, that John Fogerty is a coast listener. He's one of us. He's curious about many of the topics that we cover here, and I know that he listens to the program. One of the reasons I know is because a couple of weeks ago, I picked this bumper song by an old country artist named Lefty Frizzell, and the very first email I get after the show is from one John Fogerty, who says he was listening that night and almost fell out of his chair, and it was a song that he had wanted to record. So I know our guest listens, and in a moment he's going to listen to a few of your calls. The lines are already jammed. We'll get to as many of your calls as we can here in our next segment of Coast to Coast AM. John, I promised to ask about a couple of songs, and then we'll go to the phones, because if I don't go there soon, I'll get killed. Lodi. So I ask about that because I grew up around Lodi, San Joaquin County, Stockton. I have family still in Lodi. My memories are of picking grapes and farm labor. It's not entirely positive memories. I would not want to be stuck in Lodi, but where'd that song come from?
Well, when I was a baby, really young, my family would go up. I grew up in El Cerrito, which is in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, and we would go up to a place in winters, and there was a little cabin they would rent for a couple of weeks, and you know, I remember it as a really idyllic thing. But all during that time, we would go out and drive around, you know, Central California, and so I heard about Lodi. And other places that I love, like Dixon, you know, Tracy, some of these small towns. And Lodi just stuck in my – but I wasn't really a musician yet, but I was collecting things that sounded, I don't know, cool to me. It was a word that sounded like a song, even though I wasn't really going to, you know, didn't know that I was going to do that. Another version of that same process was Green River, which I would see on the soda fountain drink, on the big bottle of syrup that was behind the counter. And I collected that. I mean, in a sense, I just said, yeah, I'm saving that Green River. It sounds cool. I'm going to do something with it. I just, as in the case with Lodi, I didn't know what I was going to do with it, but eventually when I grew a little older, I made a song.
It Came Out of the Sky. I think you told me once that that's from your love of old sci-fi movies.
Oh, absolutely. Like many kids in the 50s. I thought it was every kid, actually. And the idea that, a lot of these science fiction films were about aliens landing and, trying to take over control of the population, that sort of thing. One of my favorites was, what was that called? Invaders from Mars.
Sure.
Or Invasion from Mars, because the little kid was the star of the movie, the main character. But anyway, it seemed to be a scenario of what would happen when this, and we're still talking about this, aren't we? When the actual ship finally comes down and lands in, on the White House lawn or whatever. And I was kind of turning it into a kind of a reality show before there was such a thing, meaning in the end, my character Jody wants to take possession and then sell it. That's what that song's about.
One last song I'll ask about, then we'll take some calls. The Old Man Is Down the Road, which is a great song, but you got sued over that song for plagiarizing yourself, which is preposterous.
Well, what's the word? The Old Man Down the Road to me was sort of another scary, kind of voodoo-y, creepy idea for perhaps a movie. And I had to kind of condense all that and make it into a song. And you're right. It's because that was my first record out of the box after being, hidden away for 15 years or so. The first, it was that it sounded like me. That song, the lyrics, my voice, the way I treated the guitar, which is me playing my kind of guitar. That recording sounded to people like a lot of my other music, and the old record company decided that they didn't want me to be successful without them owning it, so they sued. They lost. But it was part of that whole thing that went on. Where it's really unpleasant, and these days I'm in such a happier place. I'm glad I got there.
We move on. We'll go to the wild card line. Bill in Los Angeles. Hey, Bill, what's on your mind?
Hi, George. Mr. Fogerty, I hope you forgive me, but instead of buying your singles as a 13-year-old in 1969, I recorded them off local AM radio stations on a 3-inch reel-to-reel tape recorder that still works in order to steal your guitar licks on Sweet Hitchhiker and Looking Out My Back. And two quick questions. Were you inspired by Eric Clapton to abandon your 1960s Gibson humbucking distortion in favor of the mellow Fender Strat sound you both adopted? And exactly what is a hoodoo?
I love Eric Clapton, and I wasn't sure that he abandoned his distortion. I figure that those sort of things are part of the overall bouquet, I guess you'd say, or the gumbo of an artist. I certainly don't feel like I've abandoned my distortion. I think it's just something you go through for a while, then you try something else, whatever's keeping your interest. Let's see. A hoodoo, by the way, is a mysterious, perhaps fabled entity. It's a shadowy thing. It might be an intelligent creature, and it might be a ghost, or it could even be some sort of spell. At least that's my understanding.
That's a great word. First-time caller Mark in Missouri. You're on with John Fogerty.
Hi, guys. Talking
Hi,
to two really cool dudes here. I met John down at New Orleans Jazz Fest. I don't remember what year it was. Got to shake his hand. I guess I'll get to my question. Do you have any thoughts about David Crosby? And do you know Carlos Santana? And
let's take those two, and we'll take it from there. Thanks for calling, Mark.
Sure. David, it's so sad that he has passed, one of the most wonderful singers ever in popular music. and of course the harmonies that he did in the Byrds, and particularly Crosby, Stills, and Nash. I mean, that's just, when you find a blend like that, when voices work together like that, it's truly remarkable. And because we exalt it so much, it's rare when that happens. David was wonderful. I've known Carlos since our days back in San Francisco at the Fillmore. Used to hang, when we were all kids, and loved to talk to him and his bandmates. We were kind of in a similar position, striving to make the big time.
Thanks, Mark. East of the Rockies, Jeff in Montana. Hi, Jeff. You're on with John Fogerty.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. And
sure.
John, thanks for the music. Your music got me through some really tough times 30 years ago when I was a teenager dealing with cancer and stuff. But I enjoy your lesser-known music just as much as your hits. The thing is, interviewers never ask about the lesser-known music, so I have a couple questions relating to that.
Jeff, ask me something.
Yeah, do you still have the rights to your songs as the Gollywogs? Like Fight Fire is a really sweet song. And then my other questions related to your self-titled album, which I love, and I really hope in the bumper music they have Almost Saturday Night, because I think that's one of the best songs you've ever written. That was your first album after you got away from Fantasy. Was at Asylum Records, I think. And I wondered what it felt like to kind of get away from Fantasy and start doing things on your own. And my CD re-release of that actually has a Fantasy label on it, so I don't know if there's some weird stuff where they needed to get rights to do something. And I listened to a bootleg of your unreleased Hoodoo album, and I thought it was really good, but I heard that you're maybe talked out of releasing that, so I kind of wanted to know the story of how things worked with those two albums and about that Hoodoo album.
Okay, Jeff, I'll tell you what, that's a lot to chew on. Let's let John respond to at least some of that. John?
Well, sure. First of all, I just want to say that my relationship now with music and record companies is very good. I'm very happy. It's been like a weight has been lifted off me that's probably been there most of my life. I just, this is a blessing, what has happened to me, and I'm only looking forward and not worrying too much about, things that had happened that maybe were negative, because now I'm whole and I'm playing with my family and just loving life very much. Let's see, you asked about Hoodoo. Well, I always, I hate to say it, but I always felt that it kind of wasn't up to my standards, and maybe parts of it weren't very good. But, Jeff, recently my wife asked me, John, why don't you think about re-recording those songs, and she can be very persuasive. And I feel this, it's almost like she wants me to take the trash out or something, and I'm going, oh, gosh, I don't want to do that, but we'll see. I mean, some people really like that record, and I feel like it maybe wasn't my best stuff. And thank you for liking it. That's, I suppose, the most I can say about it right now.
Do you have plans for all these songs, the rights to which you've recently reacquired? Do you have a master plan? Not that you're going to spill it here, but you got an idea of some things you want to do?
My master plan is Julie. It's all in one word, Julie. I love my wife dearly, and she is so fantastic. And I call this a blessing. I still feel that way, and I think the way I would phrase it right now is I want to sort of get the songs out there that I've already written, the song, that are recorded either with Creedence or otherwise, so the songs in my solo career, just sort of celebrate that they're there and that I'm happy about it. I think that's the big change. People should know that. In fact, we really are planning on touring from now on, hopefully making solid plans about this year that we're in right here. So kind of with that idea, celebrating those wonderful times with when I wrote songs for Creedence, and at other times too. And even though it was at some point the number one band in the world, there's the world being such a big place, there are a lot of folks who actually don't know about that music and also don't know that John Fogerty wrote those songs.
Yeah, I try to play some of the lesser-known songs that were great songs that just, had so many hits, they just kind of got lost in the shuffle. But, man, there's a gigantic catalog of great stuff that the general public, especially younger people, don't know yet, but they're going to, I hope so. West of the Rockies, John in San Francisco. Hi, John.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, what's on your mind?
John.
Oh, great. Hey, John. So I was just wondering, as somebody who's dealt with kind of the whole system with the record companies and everything else, right? I was wondering your opinion on, the Art Bell archives and the fact that they're for pay with Coast to Coast AM, and also your opinion on, pizza rolls. Yeah, you like hot pizza rolls? You like?
All right.
Pizza?
We'll see you later, John. Bye. Yeah, John likes.
I don't know if you want me to answer that. I'm happy to pay for stuff I like.
Yeah. Let's go to Bree in Upper Michigan on the wild card line. Hey, Bree, what's on your mind?
Hello. I love being on the wild card line. This is my third time. Finally get to talk to George Knapp. I already got to talk to the other George, and now I get to talk to John Fogerty. Oh, my gosh. So I'm like 30.
Hi, Bree. How you doing?
Good. I stayed up late tonight. Bad mom. But I finally get to listen to Coast Live, and I love paying for my app. And in the Proud Mary song, we never do anything nice or easy.
There you go. That's nice right.
And rough. It's awesome. I never knew that you wrote that song, actually. I listened to CCR growing up. I had good parents, so they, brought me on to the good stuff. And I guess, I want to know what your favorite topic on Coast to Coast is. I love the secret ops stuff and
I think I like the stuff that's that shows what do you call it, a telepathic connection, and perhaps even with so-called aliens that maybe that you hear them talk about a lot, maybe the multiverse, rather, in other words, in another dimension rather than thousands or hundreds of thousands of miles, millions of miles away. Maybe it's right here, just in a different frequency. I find all of that kind of thing very fascinating.
Bree, thank you for the call. We're going to Mike in Denver. Hey, Mike, how you doing?
George, good morning. Thank you so much for taking my call, and I just want to compliment you on this interview. It's been absolutely outstanding. And John Fogerty, thank you so much for your music, and also for your kids' music, Tyler and Shane. They are amazing artists in their own right, so I wanted to say thank you. And
bless you for that.
Absolutely. And so, John, what I wanted to ask you about is one of my favorite songs of yours in CCR, Down on the Corner. Obviously it wasn't a huge statement song, but more of a fun song. Could you talk about how Down on the Corner kind of came to be and what that song really means to you after all these years?
Sure. One of my favorite. By the way, I love songs like that, too. Wooly Bully is one of my very favorite records. Yeah, I had seen an ad in the newspaper. It was about Winnie the Pooh, who, by the way, is still part of my family and part of the culture in the Fogerty family. I share that with my daughter, Kelsey, and she's 20 now, but for 20 years we've been talking about Winnie the Pooh. There was an ad in the paper all those years ago. It said something like Super Pooh Package, and you could send away, I think, for either some books or some recordings of Winnie the Pooh. And I looked at that phrase because I had young children at the time, so this was in my heart. And it, Winnie the Pooh, and it was, how can I say it? It looked like an awesome character, a cultural event almost. And I started toying with that as being the name of a band. And I said, wow, instead of Winnie the Pooh, how about Willie and the Pooh, Willie and the Pooh Bears. And it turned into Willie and the Poor Boys. And I started writing a song about this mythical band that would be down on I just said it. That would be out in the street, right, with their little instruments, with they're like a little wash tub and a scratcher and all that sort of thing, maybe a harmonica, and just thought it was a delightful scene to write a song about a band that makes that sort of music and the joy that brings to everybody watching and participating. And it's still one of my favorite songs to play for all those reasons.
Thanks to all of our callers. John, I can't tell you how happy that your fans are for you and your family on this great news about getting your songs back. I mean, your elation is so genuine. It comes across on stage, how much you enjoy performing. I can't wait to see you again in person and in concert, and you're welcome here anytime. Thanks so much for doing this.
Oh, George, thank you so much. It's been great being with you. And, of course, I'm always listening.
We're glad to hear that. John Fogerty, one and only, music icon, great guitar player. We've played a lot of his songs here tonight. Hope you'll check out some of those albums. They're still out there and still classic stuff. We go into the break with one more of his songs, 110 in the Shade. We'll be right back with Thanks again to John Fogerty. I think we probably could have kept him here about a week and not exhausted all the questions that we and the listeners have for him. I mentioned at the top of the program, we have our usual collection of Knapp's news items. You can find them on the Coast to Coast website. Among the stories there tonight, why our views of the sky are vanishing. It gets harder and harder to see the stars because of light pollution over much of the globe. We have a story about it based on a new scientific study. Also, an update on Jorg Arnu. You might remember he's the guy who runs a website devoted to all things Area 51. Back in November, Jorg and his girlfriend were here on the show telling us about a raid on their homes by federal agents who kicked in their doors, took all their computers and cameras and phones. No charges have been filed. None are likely to be filed, but they will likely never get their stuff back. Now, other national media have finally picked up on that story. Fox News, for one, and we have a print story there on the website, as well as insider video recorded showing what happens to animals in factory farm operations. Hard to watch. Those stories and more in Knapp's News. And while you're on the website, check out how to become a Coast Insider. The cost is 15 cents a day. If you subscribe for a year, gives you access to a huge archive of programs and interviews, including the Art Bell Vault. And I think everyone except for the pizza roll caller might like that. We have other information there about how you can subscribe to George Norrie's television program, Beyond Belief, wherein George interviews fascinating guests, similar to what he does here on the radio. With that, we move on. Have you ever had a weird, scary nightmare that lingers in your head, maybe pops back up again and again? Well, of course you have. What do they mean? Where do they come from? Is there a way to interpret nightmares? Our next guest, J.M. DeBord, says yes. He will join us in just a moment. Welcome back. J.M. DeBord is a best-selling author of several books about dreams and is the creator of Dreams 123, a process of dream interpretation, known worldwide for his ability to demystify the subject of dream interpretation. Mr. DeBord sets his sights on the dark side of dreaming in his latest book, Nightmares, Your Guide to Interpreting Your Darkest Dreams. Jason, welcome.
Hey, George, it's a pleasure to be on the show. Thank you for having me.
Do I call you Jason or JM?
Let's just go with Jason.
Okay. So the idea for this book, in part at least, reading the beginning of it, it comes from your own personal experience, a terrifying dream or series of dreams that you had as a kid. Let's start with the story there.
All right. Well, when I was a young child, I had a dream that I was just biking down the neighborhood along the streets of my neighborhood. And I felt this presence behind me, and I turned around, and there was this man in a black car who was following me. And I kind of zoom in on his face, and I see that he's got all these burn scars on him, and he's got almost like a Nightmare on Elm Street looking kind of guy. And of course, the movie wasn't out at the time. This was the late 1970s, and I try to get away from him, and the man tracks me down in a store. And the last thing I know is that he's coming to claim my soul. Now, as a kid, I didn't really know what a soul was, but I just knew that it was the most important part of me. And this man wanted it. And if he caught me, he was going to have it. I was going to be dead. He was going to have my soul, and story over. So I woke up from the dream, and it was like any other dream that you have when you're 9 years old, you wake up, your heart's pounding, you're sweating. I was probably screaming when I woke up, So a nightmare at that age isn't unusual. But what became unusual for me, George, was that a few years later, I was in an enrichment class, and my teacher invited in a dream analyst who asked the class, has anyone had a nightmare that really stuck with them and they'd like to try to figure out what it meant? And my hand shot up because that nightmare had really stuck with me. I'd had other nightmares, but for some reason that one just kind of, once it grabbed hold of me, it wouldn't let go. And I would think about it periodically. We went into a regression process to try to find out what was behind the nightmare. And what I imagined was that there were these two families who were in conflict with each other, and that there was like a blood feud between them. And the analyst asked me to try to find a resolution for their problem. And, at about 12 years old at this point, I thought, well, fighting is wrong. You shouldn't be hurting each other. Can't we all just get along? And that didn't work out real well. The scene turned really unstable. The analyst pulled me out of it. And, kind of life goes on at that point. But I'm kind of a wounded animal at that point. There is something kind of leaving a blood trail through my life as I get into my teenage years and then into my 20s. And this man who was in my dreams kept coming back. That man, the original nightmare, he kept coming back. And as I got into my 20s, he really became this regular presence in my nightmares. And I had this dream one night where his minions came to kidnap me off of a street. And I said, no, I'm ready to go find him. Just tell me where he is. And I appear in this black office tower, like, tall and glass. And I'm at the top floor, and there's nothing in the room except for a coffin made of glass. And I come up to the coffin, and I see the man in there, and he looks like he's vulnerable. And all this rage towards this man for all the hurt and pain he'd caused me just bubbled over, boiled over. And I grabbed hold of his neck, and my fingers sink into his neck, and I'm looking him in the eyes as I'm trying to strangle the life out of him. And he's laughing, like he's laughing at me. And I figured out later it was because he was getting me to feed on my anger, kind of like Luke Skywalker in the Star Wars mythology. When he has the final battle with the Dark Lord, what are they trying to do? They're trying to get him to feed on his anger. And by doing that, you become the very thing that you hate. So I go later into my 20s, into my 30s, and this thing is still haunting me, and these nightmares are still recurring. And a friend of mine who was wise about these things and knew enough about me said, I think there's something more going on here than just, ordinary nightmares caused by things, addictive behaviors, traumas, things that normally cause nightmares. And I agreed with her because I'd worked for so long to try to figure out what was behind these nightmares, and I could never really get to the source of it. So, George, I ended up seeing a shaman, a man named Steve Rogat in North Carolina, who I was referred to by that friend. And we ended up doing a shamanic ritual. And I found out that behind that man, the dreams called him the Dark Master, and that behind him, the source of it was actually something that was generational in my family. He told me that somebody had used the power of black magic against my family generations ago, and that it was carrying down through the line to me and had carried through other members of my family. And you could see a lot of tragedy in my family, and it started to make sense. And what's funny, though, is that this shaman, Steve, didn't know really anything about me at that point. He was just pulling in this information from above. And we went into a ritual, and we found the man. And to make a long story short, I had a kind of a confrontation with him in a metaphysical space. And at the conclusion of it, I felt this rush of energy go through my body, through my being, and I felt this darkness just rise up off of me and go up into the light. And at that point, the shaman clapped his hands once really loudly, and I felt like it was finally done and over with. And so that's what led me into writing about nightmares, because I had a personal experience with it that I felt like people who maybe have experienced something like generational nightmares would relate to, and that they needed someone like me, who's known as an expert about, dreams, to be able to validate their experience for them. So
and, as I read your story about being in school and doing a hypnotic regression there in your classroom, thinking to myself, wow, imagine the lawsuits that would happen if that happened to some student now.
Yeah, that was the early 1980s, and it was an enrichment class. And, George, the teacher in that class, Mr. Whitmore, I'll never forget him. Sometime before then in the school year, he caught me in class reading I found, and here's another thing you don't find these days. I found a book on witchcraft in the school library, and it contained spells in what I think was in German. It was like actual witchcraft spells. And I'm sitting there trying to show off to a friend of mine by reading this stuff. And the teacher felt this sort of, dark energy gathering around me. And he very seriously comes up to me and he's like, don't ever do that again. And I'm like, well, why? I'm just goofing off. And he's like, don't ever do that again. And he made me return the book to the library. And I think he might have brought in that analyst because he had a hunch, because it was a very unusual experience, even for the early 1980s. And I'm thankful to this day, because, George, it gave me something that led me further into my life, where I eventually found the solution to this. I wouldn't have ever known that there was a solution unless I would have been down the path of dream interpretation, as I've done professionally. By doing that for myself and writing about this subject, it armed me with the information and tools that I needed to resolve this 30-year ordeal.
Yeah, I mean, the Dark Man put you on a path that changed your life. Thank you, Dark Man.
Yeah, and and oddly, I found that the power to be able to respond to such a situation is something that you can carry over into other aspects of your life. And I learned something from the experience of this, which is that we have this very odd way of creating the heroes in our world, is we put them through life and death ordeals, or at least by pushing them to their limits and beyond. If you look at what special forces soldiers go through when they're in training, maybe 1 out of 20 of them, let's say, are able to pass the test. And this is also the kind of ordeal that saints and shamans and others go through. We seem to have this thing built deep into our own minds that will create challenges for us. And some of us go out and seek them. We might climb a mountain or go through special forces training, or, some kind of get a master's degree and enter into some kind of rarefied field of knowledge, something that will really challenge us. But then there are others who they seem to create their challenges more through having to face ordeals of a different kind. And I found that sometimes that's what's really behind people's nightmares. They want the challenge to be able to overcome it. And the thing about it, George, is that it's kind of an all or nothing deal. I mean, it's kind of do or die in a way, because that experience that I had could have not ended up so well for me. I know other people who didn't make it through those kinds of ordeals, and they end up crushed by them. So the way that I found that this works, ultimately you are setting yourself up to be able to face a challenge so that you can answer the call to greatness, or at least have the opportunity to.
And are all nightmares metaphorical, in a sense that they're not literal to the events that you recall from your dreams or nightmares, that they're all allegorical, metaphorical, and you got to figure out what your brain is trying to tell you?
I find that there are layers to it. And yes, most nightmares, dreams, are metaphorical. They're little stories that are told to help you to learn. And they use metaphors because they get around the ego's defenses and barriers. metaphors leap right over top of those barriers and defenses. And so that's one reason why dreams speak to us mostly in metaphors. However, there is an objective side to some dreams. Louise von Franz, who was a student of Carl Jung, said that around 20% of dreams are objective, meaning that they're speaking more literally than they are figuratively, and that you are going to have everyone almost nightly is going to have dreams that are objective. When people, though, have these experiences like I had, I think that it's better to approach it where the odds are in the favor of it being something metaphorical, because it can easily, for one, you can mislead yourself into thinking that a nightmare is something more than what it really is. Most of them are stories that are told using the language of symbolism, which is just what an ordinary dream does. But then if you don't find the answers, if you don't find the meaning and understand the dream through that route, then you need to start looking at the possibility, at least, that it might not be metaphorical, that there might be something that's objective and literal about it.
And do you have a working definition of what becomes a nightmare, what qualifies? Just something that's scary, or how do you break it down?
Usually it's the emotional affect of it. A nightmare, I mean, dreams and nightmares are being produced by the same process going on in the mind. The imaginative centers of the mind turn on and create these experiences for us that we know as dreams. But when you get into what you would classify as a nightmare, is that it's going to be, for one, very emotional. It's going to affect you deeply. And two, is it's probably going to wake you up. You know, like you could have an anxiety dream, you could have a bad dream, and at the conclusion of it, it won't necessarily wake you up, unless you wake up naturally to like use the bathroom or something. But a nightmare is probably going to shock you awake. And that is one of the ways that you can classify the difference between a bad dream and a nightmare. That's level of emotional affect, and does it wake you up or not? The nightmare is being produced by the same processes that's going on that are producing your dreams. So being able to tell the difference is usually a felt sense of what it is that you experienced and how strongly you reacted to it.
And
in a negative sort of way.
You make a further distinction between nightmares and night terror?
Good question. Yes. And, you know, this finding out the difference for me actually started on my last appearance on Coast to Coast. We had a caller who described night terrors, and I tried to approach it as helping him with nightmares. And I came to understand that there is a difference between them. And the main thing is that a night terror is an energetic process. Because of trauma, the energy of trauma has been absorbed into your nervous system. And then you go to sleep and you relax enough that that energy can be triggered and released. So the way that I learned about this in a more in-depth sort of way was through a friend of mine who was having chronic nightmares we thought were nightmares. And what he described to me was just the most horrible sorts of carnage that you could imagine, just terrible experiences. And I couldn't find a source of it. George, I've been working with dreams for 30 years now, and I've been through all the schools of thought. I teach dream interpretation. So, you know, I should be able to find, especially with a friend who I'm working with closely, and have multiple conversations over a span of time about what he was experiencing. And I kept thinking, these are nightmares, there has to be a source behind it. But when he explained to me what had happened to him when he was a teenager, where he had the experience of having a gun pointed at him and being told that he was going to die, that he was going to be murdered by this person holding the gun. The person holding the gun was his stepfather. He had to live in the same home with this person, which meant that he experienced that terror, that there was the initial terror of thinking he was going to die. But then there was also the daily grind of living with someone who was that callous and dark-hearted, and the fear that he lived under imprinted this energy into his nervous system. So there he was 30 years later, and he's been out of that environment for all that time, but the trauma of what he experienced was still trapped within his own body, within his nervous system. And when he would go to bed at night, it would release, and then it became a night terror, because it's just the imagery that you're experiencing when it's the dreaming function of the mind is creating the imagery, but it's the input that it's receiving is not the traditional input that gets turned into a nightmare.
All right, Jason, we're going to have to take a break. The Beatles are telling us we're going to take a break here now, talking about nightmares, your guide to interpreting your darkest dreams with Jason DeBord. We're talking about nightmares. Let's say you have a dream, a terrifying dream, wherein you're being chased by a Frankenstein-type monster. Or, as I've had a couple of times in the last month, dreams about nuclear war. Should you consider these to be prophetic? Do they mean something? What, if anything, do they mean? Jason DeBord is our guest. He's written a book called Nightmares, Your Guide to Interpreting Your Darkest Dreams. We're going to get into some of those scenarios, and then we'll hear from you a little bit later to share some of your nightmares with us and see if Jason can make sense of them. We'll be right back. Jason DeBord, in last segment, you mentioned generational nightmares, and it sounds like that could be some mumbo-jumbo that people have made up, but there is actually some scientific evidence to suggest that memories can be passed down through DNA, and I guess nightmares along with them, right?
Yeah, there is. I've encountered it too many times at Reddit and also in my own experience to say that it couldn't exist, which is often what you hear from people who are the experts, quote unquote. The ones who have the kind of stick to the science types. They'll say, well, there's no evidence that this exists. That couldn't happen. And you go, well, no, there is such a thing as cellular memory, and it might be that memory itself doesn't necessarily reside in brain cells. Memory could be something that is ubiquitous to the fabric of space and time itself, which is what some people believe too. However it works, I have seen it happen many times where these generational nightmares get carried down because of the trauma that has happened to your ancestors. Or also, I found it with races and ethnic groups too. Family traumas that have carried down. And George, you can dream about it as if it was your own experience. Sometimes the nightmares are things where you see through the eyes of the people who actually experienced it. And other times you're given a little bit of cushion by being kind of a fly on the wall to observe these things. And when people find out that that's what they experienced, that these nightmares are not coming from personal content, from their own, conflicts and the other things that are the sorts of sources, dysfunction and traumas and conflicts and anxieties and stresses and things that are the usual causes of nightmares. And you go, well, let me rule those things out. Well, what's left? The example that I give in my book was a man who had these dreams about a black wave of death rolling across a rural landscape. And he's standing with these people, and it seems kind of like a village environment. And they just all know that when that wave reaches them, they're going to die. There's no way they can outrun it. They're not getting away. They're just getting ready to die. And we went through all the standard sorts of ways of trying to interpret the imagery, and nothing resonated with them. And finally, I had a hunch, and I said, has your family experienced something that was akin to a black wave of death? Like, go back into your ancestry, into your lineage. And he's like, oh, yeah, they were in Poland in 1939 when the Nazis rolled across, and, they all died. And he made the connection. He realized that the eyes that he was seeing out of, the black wave of death was sort of a metaphor for the Nazi invasion, and that the experience that he was having in those nightmares was actually seeing out of the eyes of one of his ancestors. So, yes, generational nightmares are a real thing, and I think that this is something that is becoming more widely known now because of the acceptance. the people who want to say just stick to the science, there's no proof for this, they can have that position. But there are people who are realizing now that there is something more going on to this, and our science perhaps is not really caught up to it, except for we're finding out that memory is not necessarily like I opened with. It's not necessarily stored in the brain. The memory seems to be coming from somewhere else, and we do know that there are epigenetics involved and cellular memory that can carry these memories down to us in the current generations so that we know what has happened in previous generations because it's built into us.
So you have people come to you for help. They're being terrorized by these recurrent dreams. It's messing with their waking lives. How do they find you, and what do you do for them?
Well, they usually find me on Reddit, or they type in something into a search engine such as like "help, I need a dream interpreter," and it leads them to me. But since I've been on Reddit for 10 years now as the lead moderator at Reddit Dreams, people have heard about me, and they come and they find me, and they share these experiences that they've had where they come looking for answers. And it's for one, I can't tell anyone what their dreams mean. I can't tell them where their nightmares are coming from exactly. What I really want to do in that role is to help to lead them to their own answers and conclusions. This is especially important with nightmares because people often look for experts to tell them what their problems are and what the solutions are to them. And the nightmares are actually asking them to take responsibility for themselves. And one of the places where I begin with helping with nightmares is to take that word responsibility and divide it into two. Responsibility, as in the ability to respond. You may feel like these nightmares are just crushing you, but you do have the ability to respond. And that is the first step if you're going to make it through this, that you must do. Is find your ability to be able to respond to it, no matter what it is and what it is coming to you in your nightmares, or what you think or fear that it is. This is especially important when people think that something supernatural is after them in their dreams, is they feel like they're up against something that they have no chance against. And I go, no, first of all, you can respond to this. And second of all, if it's coming into your dreams, it's coming into your territory because those are your dreams. And if there really is something supernatural in your dreams, it is asking for trouble, because it was soon as you realize that you do have the ability to respond, that you are only limited in a dream space by your beliefs, meaning that you can imagine anything in a dream and make it happen. Now you can start to respond. And that's usually where I start with people when they come to me for help. I want them to be able to respond in a proactive sort of way. And I want them to know another thing, George, and this is very important when it comes to dream work, is Carl Jung said that dreams are only for our benefit. And that includes nightmares too. There is a function of the mind that creates dreams, and it's coming from deep inside of you, from the unconscious side of your mind. And its agenda is only to help you. Now, it might be helping you in the same sort of way that a shock therapy is going to help you.
I was going to ask, does it become a nightmare extra scary because our unconscious is trying to get our attention about something?
Yes, and usually it's tried gentler means to get the message across to you, but you haven't gotten the message yet. So it keeps cranking up the volume, cranking up the juice. And when it becomes to the nightmare level, it usually means that you have ignored the previous warning signs. You didn't listen when the message was spoken more softly. And now it's having to crank it up to 11 to be able to get the message across, because there's something that's wrong that needs help. Now, whether you seek that help out from someone like me, or you go to, a therapist, or there's some area of your life, like maybe your finances are just chronically bad. You've got all this stress from money or job or relationship or something, and you need help with it. Or you can find your own ability to be able to respond to it without going to somebody, like an outsider. Either way, that's where it's going to begin for you is realizing that the nightmares are not trying to beat you down. They're trying to get you to respond. And
right.
That first step that you take in that direction is towards healing and towards growth. And so that's why it's so important to get that message, because George, and I tell people this it's unfortunate that I have to break this to them, but I tell them the nightmares are not going to go away on their own. You have to do something proactively. There's something in your life that's causing this. Now, could it be something like, a simpler solution like it's bad digestion? You're eating something before bed, it's digesting and it's not digesting real well. And perhaps that's the source of it. It could be something where you go, well, I don't have a lot of stress in my life. I don't have any chronic dysfunction. My job isn't killing me, that kind of thing. And you go, okay, well, there might be something else that's happening. Another one that is a very frequent source of nightmares that can be addressed very proactively and quickly is chronic sleep deprivation. We're sitting there talking to people who, right now on the East Coast, it's going on, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning. You get people who work these, they have these shift jobs where they work at staggered times or they work third shift. And I find this a lot with them, where what's actually happening with the reason why they're experiencing these chronic nightmares is because their sleep is so jangled up, and it's been happening over a period of time. And so if you can identify what it is like that's causing the nightmares, you can go, okay, you do have a solution here that perhaps where you could get on a better work schedule, or you can make sure that sleep is more important for, you make it a higher priority, and you especially don't allow people to say, well, you can lose a little sleep and it won't hurt you. I'm sorry, but that is just, we're finding out that getting a good night's sleep is one of the number one things you can do to help yourself. And not getting a good night of sleep, especially recurrently, is one of the worst things that you can do for your health over the long term. So yes, you must do that. But if it's not something like, bad digestion or bad sleep patterns or something like that, and it's something that is more of a chronic dysfunction in your life, then you definitely need to address what it is. And again, it's not going to go away on its own. So whatever you have to do to respond to it, realize that the nightmares are screaming in your face because you need to get the message.
Have you had any dreams that you consider to be prophetic? Somebody has some disaster that they're seeing in their dreams, and then it happens. There were a lot of accounts of people who dreamed about 9/11 before it happened, including some psychics who've worked for intelligence agencies whose dreams were pretty specific. What do you make of that?
Yeah, having dealt with this at Reddit through my own dream life, and on my podcast, The Dreams That Shape Us, we've addressed precognitive dreams in a few of our episodes. And the 9/11 is a classic case where there was a mass event that people dreamed about that ahead of time, before it actually happened. There was a schoolboy in New Jersey. This disappeared from the news. I have not been able to find it, but I read it, I think, in Newsweek. Well, right after the attacks, there was a boy in New Jersey who was from that part of the world, maybe from Afghanistan. As parents came over here as immigrants, and he dreamed about like a soccer ball going between two goalposts, and the goalpost collapsed into a heap of, rubble. He was in a classroom in New Jersey right across, from the Twin Towers. And apparently right after the attacks, he was never seen again. I know of other people. We had Laurel Clark on my show as a guest, and she had some dreams about 9/11 and something that was involving her husband. also. So these precognitive dreams, or you might call them prophetic dreams, but there is a difference. A prophetic dream is something that is going to come to pass no matter how you respond to it. It's written in stone. Whereas a precognitive dream, you have the ability to be able to respond to it. You could kind of think of it as a preview, but it's not set in stone yet. And you do have perhaps the ability to be able to change the outcome in the future. I've seen this also with other events. It seems like things like when you have things in the news like wars, it produces a lot of dreams in response. Earthquakes and natural disasters. I've run across a number of dreams where people they had them ahead of time. They had a feeling that these events were going to happen because they dreamed about them ahead of time. And usually they have some kind of a personal connection to it. There was a big earthquake down in South America, and a guy was saying that he dreamed about it exactly as it happened. You know, he knew where it was going to strike. He could see it from like a bird's eye point of view. All happened ahead of time. And it was kind of mysterious at first why he would dream about a place that was so far away from where he lived, but it turned out that that's where he was born. So he still had that sort of inner connection to that place. And when just before the earthquake struck, he dreamed about it ahead of time. These accounts have come throughout history, George. I mean, there have been so many prophetic dreams that it would be almost silly to say that they don't happen. Julius Caesar ignored his wife's prophetic dream that he was going to die by being stabbed, and that morning, after she talked him out of going to the Senate, and then Brutus came along and said, "Oh, that was just a silly dream. Come on over to the Senate. We have a nice event planned for you." And that's when they assassinated him, you know. So, and there have been many other historical accounts too. Sugar Ray Robinson had a dream that he was going to kill his opponent, Jimmy Doyle, accidentally in the ring. And he tried to back out of the fight. And the fight promoters brought in a priest to tell him that it was just a dream. It's not going to come true. Get out there and do what you do, Sugar Ray. So he got into the ring, and, you know, in the heat of the moment, he knocked Jimmy Doyle flat, and Doyle died that night. And in his autobiography, Sugar Ray said, "Man, I knew it, but I did it anyway. I should never have let them talk me into doing that fight because the dream told me, God told me, he thought it was God told him through a dream that he shouldn't be out there fighting against Doyle." So there have been many cases like this, ones that are known like that and ones that are not so known. Yes.
In your book, Nightmares, Your Guide to Interpreting Your Darkest Dreams, you break down nightmares into multiple categories, all kinds of monsters, demons, natural disasters, accidents. We're going to get into some of those and take calls from our listeners. I know they've got dreams that want to share with you because they send me emails all the time about their dreams. And we're going to continue our conversation with Jason DeBord right after this on Coast to Coast. Maybe your nightmares involve some technological threat. Maybe they involve volcanoes, dragons, monsters. Maybe it's nuclear war that scares you in your nightmares. Whatever the cause, whatever the circumstances, your dreams, your unconscious or subconscious is trying to tell you something, and maybe something important. My guest, Jason DeBord, has written an excellent book, Nightmares, Your Guide to Interpreting Your Darkest Dreams. He breaks them down into categories, what they might mean for you. And in a moment, we're going to get into some specifics, take some of your calls. You can share with us some of your nightmares. We'll be right back with more Coast to Coast AM. Jason, we're going to get a lot of calls about nightmares. I'm going to start it off. So I've had this, I never really worried about nuclear war, not since I was much younger, but I've had two dreams in recent weeks about nuclear bombs exploding in Las Vegas. The first one was so scary it woke me up. And it was not an all-out nuclear war. It was a couple of bombs that exploded outside of Las Vegas, and I was scrambling to get shelter, and I woke up. Second time I had this dream where nuclear bombs are going off in Las Vegas, it occurred to me, aha, this is a dream. I've had this before,
nothing to worry about here. It's not really a nuclear bomb. So I was okay after that. What's your take on that one?
Knowing that the first nuclear bomb test took place out there in the 1940s, I would wonder if there's some kind of residue of that left over. But let's explore the idea of possibility for interpretation. One of the things could be just the anticipation of something really big coming up. If there's, look at that as kind of a metaphor, George. Is there, where are the bombs going off in your life? Dreams exaggerate things. So this is where people kind of get hung up. They go, well, why would the big argument that I had with someone be turned into a dream where it's a nuclear explosion? They go, well, there's no, nothing equates between those two. But you go, well, as a metaphor, though, a bomb really did go off in your life, and maybe it's a nuclear bomb because it was a huge event. It hit you really hard. Life will not be the same before and after. That's another thing about nuclear bombs that I find to be common about the meaning of them in dreams, is that it's telling you, it's a way of reflecting that things are not going to be the same going into the future. And the same way that we all know that a nuclear war, or even just bombs going off outside of a major city, would mean that that's a turning point and nothing will ever be the same again afterwards. And I found the imagery to be used in situations like when people are, like on one lady who I have this example in my book, the one lady knew that her parents were getting a lot older and that there was going to come a time when they weren't going to all be together, her and her family, there was an inevitability about the fact that her parents were elderly and that the end was going to come for their time together on this earth. So that was kind of like the bombs go off in the distance, and her reaction is to huddle together with them and say, I'm glad that we've all been family. I love you. And that's really what the dreams were reflecting. Now, George, in your second dream, your reaction is to realize that there's nothing to fear. If there really was, if it was like a prophetic dream, I would think that it would override your thought in the dream, like, oh, I've had this dream before, it's no big deal. And then you go, yeah, that's right, it's not any big deal. And the dream doesn't keep pressing the issue on you.
Right.
If there really was a sort of a premonition in that, the dream would say, no, George, it's time to pack up and get the kids out of town.
Right. Well, I do live in the most nuked state in the most nuked place in the whole entire world. So you're right. There might be some psychic residuals there of some sort. You write early in your book, Nightmares, you write about aliens, the alien scenario. Do you have people who tell you they're about an alien invasion nightmare, aliens showing up in their dreams?
It is one of the most common dream themes, yes.
And you refer back to Carl Jung, of course, who had written a lot about UFOs, calling them a myth in one sense, and which people have misinterpreted what he was meaning. But Jung seems to be, I mean, you rely on him a lot. He was way ahead of the curve on this dream stuff.
Yeah, he was. And a lot of the ways that we're seeing things that manifest from the unconscious mind, dreams and nightmares just being but two sorts of manifestations of a wide spectrum of things that can come out of the unconscious. You could say that premonitions and things like that also come out of the unconscious. And Jung had some experiences of his own that taught him that there is a collective layer to the unconscious mind, and it made him break with Sigmund Freud over this, because Freud said, no, the unconscious is just sort of a repository for the repressed desires and memories, usually from early childhood, that are not, appropriate now that you've gotten older, and you're just repressing it all down in there, and then your unconscious, for the most part, just regurgitates it as dreams. And Jung said, no, well, that might be true sometimes, but there's this deeper layer to things of the unconscious mind, a collective part to it. And what led him to that conclusion was during the 1920s, in his from his office outside of in Switzerland, I think it's outside of Zurich, he was getting these patients who had German ancestry, some of them from Germany, who were dreaming about Wotan, who is this bloodthirsty Germanic god of war. And Jung is looking at him going, these dreams are psychopathic in a way, like, just the bloodlust that is manifesting. And he's looking at the patients, as their doctor, as their psychiatrist, and going, I don't see that level of psychopathy in these people. They might have their problems, and that's why they've come to me. But they're not. This is garden variety. These people they're not mass murderers. And what he came to realize later was that in the German people, that there was something that was brewing in the 1920s from the unconscious that manifested as the Nazis in the 1930s. And so he posited the theory of the collective unconscious after that. Now, you also asked about aliens. Do you want to talk about those, George?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't dream about aliens, but I'd like to see some either while I'm sleeping or while I'm awake. But it hasn't happened that I know.
Well, with how immersed you are in that subject, I'm kind of surprised that your dreams haven't touched on it yet.
Nope.
But maybe you have such the broad kind of rational, informed way of viewing the subject that your dreams know that it wouldn't be a good one for you, because you look at the aliens in your dreams and be like, oh, come on, you're just a guy in a costume, but because your dreams will pick themes for you that work well. That's why a certain one person will dream about an alien, or recurring dreams about aliens, because they symbolize something to them that their dreaming mind has picked up on and said, okay, let's keep pressing that button because it's working. We're getting the message across. We're getting their attention, at least. So it works well for them. But so for people who, are immersed sometimes in the lore behind something, such as aliens, they'll have a lot of dreams about it because they obviously have a natural interest in the subject. I've seen this a few times with people who studied serial killers and had a real interest in that subject. They would end up having these dreams with these confrontations with serial killers. And it turned out that it was kind of a learning experience for them, like a virtual reality simulation. But there are a lot of people who have experiences who, like with the aliens, where they say, no, the things that were in my dreams they were real beings. And I can say that in some cases, I think that was true. But I know that in most cases, the aliens are a symbol for them for something such as an alienated side to them. Something about them is so split off from the main personality that it's been alienated. Or think of it as something that drops in out of nowhere. This was one of Carl Jung's critical insights about the UFO phenomenon. And the reason why he said that it was a modern myth was because of the explosion of reports after World War II also came after people became aware that there were these things called nuclear bombs. And then we got into the Cold War in the 50s with the Russians, and we became aware of ICBMs. And people were fearing that something could drop from the sky, and they're powerless against it. And so the UFO mythology that grew up in the 1950s, what he saw was a connection between that and the fact of the circumstances that we were living under at the time. That there could be this massive change that comes and drops in out of the sky with something using a technology that, at least at the time, was foreign to most people. We understand nuclear weapons a lot better now, but until Einstein proved that you could split the atom, there was still a lot of debate, even in the physics community, whether that could be done.
Well, there are people who have dreams about aliens, what seems like a dream-like encounter, and then they wake up and they've got little marks on their bodies, or they're outside their home, or they're wearing their pants backwards, or wearing somebody else's clothes. They're in a different category. Let's take a couple of calls. First-time caller, Ty in New Orleans. Hi, Ty. You're on with J.M. DeBord.
Kind of nervous, so please forgive me on that note. I'll just get straight to it. So a month ago, I probably crashed around 8 o'clock in the evening. I fell asleep, maybe 10:30. I had a nightmare. And so I work rotating shifts. There's no hour I do not work. And so it was the graveyard shift, as I am on, I get to call it now. I keep the doors locked, and there was a woman who, in a damsel in distress fashion, was looking for help. I don't know what she was saying, but of course, raised alarm bells. I wasn't unlocking the door, anything like that. And then I looked down and I saw a man with a firearm, brandishing a firearm. And so next thing I knew, I woke up and I just was completely terrified. And I didn't know if they were casing the joint, casing my office. And so now I stay strapped. But I haven't really dwelled on it, but it's never been too far away from my thoughts. So I was wondering if you could provide some insight on that.
Yeah, Ty, we were talking, George and I were talking earlier that one of the causes of nightmares is shift work, the rotating shifts, working third shift through the night. It really goes against your body's natural rhythms. And it's not just that, but one of the things I found with people who work third shift is they'll get home at sunrise or sometime around then, and the rest of the world doesn't seem to respect the fact that their night is starting when everybody else is awake. And they end up having their sleep interrupted. They sometimes, if they have children, they've got to respond to things that are going on at school. There's people in the house who don't respect their space, and they make noise and things like that. That if it doesn't necessarily wake you up, it might be keeping you from getting into the sorts of really deep, good recuperative sleep that you need. And what happens over time is that your boundaries get really thin, and you start being unable to differentiate between things that are happening. A sound outside that your brain under normal circumstances, you would be able to discern what it is. But when you get into that thin boundary, sleep-deprived state, you start having trouble being able to make connections between things and figure out what it is. So you start filling in the blanks with kind of the worst possible scenario, or what could be the worst possible thing. It's not just a sound outside of your house; it's an intruder trying to break in. So what it sounds to me is that you had an experience where you were in that sort of sleep deprived or thin boundary sort of state, and that you started responding to it from that space inside of you. Now, I don't want to scare you, but I'll give you a fact that schizophrenia, the thing that schizophrenics have in common, if you look at across the board, the one thing that is the connector that you can say is the most common is that they're sleep deprived. They have the chronic sleep deprivation. It's not to say that you're schizophrenic, but this is not it. What I wanted to make the point of is that what happens with schizophrenia is they start being unable to differentiate their dream reality from their waking reality because they start dreaming while they are awake. Carl Jung said that the dreaming function of the mind is always running. And what can happen is when you're sleep deprived, the dreams will start coming on while your eyes are open and act as sort of an augmented reality. So that is an extreme case. And what happens with a lot of people early on, before they get to that level where, they're dreaming while awake, and that it's intruding into their everyday reality in a very forceful sort of way. What happens before then is things like where they, overreactions to situations, their emotions start to get kind of unregulated, and where things that will start entering into your dreams that start to seem really antagonistic. And that is a classic sign, actually, of sleep deprivation, because what it is your unconscious mind, which enjoys having sleep time with you and being able to produce dreams and keep you balanced and recuperated. Your unconscious mind starts sending you stronger and stronger messages that you need to pay attention to this part of your life and get the sleep that you need. That's just my guess from here, Ty. Thank you for calling.
Thanks, Ty. Yeah, he starts off by saying he's working the graveyard shift, which is there's some imagery there that probably doesn't help things. You know, I was looking during the last break, I was looking for this study that I had saved in my email somewhere. It came out last year, and it found that humans are not meant to stay awake later than midnight, which, if that were true, coast to coast either wouldn't exist or it'd be half as long as it usually is. I'm glad that there are those of us who have trouble sleeping at night or who are just generally awake into the wee hours. Otherwise, we'd have to all find something else to do for the hours between 10 and 2 a.m. So we're talking with Jason DeBord about Nightmares, Your Guide to Interpreting Your Darkest Dreams. A terrific book, terrific conversation we're having here. We'll get to as many of your calls and your nightmares as we can in this next segment, a final segment of Coast to Coast AM. We're talking with J.M. DeBord, Jason DeBord, about his excellent book, Nightmares, Your Guide to Interpreting Your Darkest Dreams. Got some really great sounding nightmares and recurring dreams hanging on the phones with our callers. We'll get to as many as we can right after this on Coast to Coast AM. Our final segment tonight with Jason DeBord. Let's take some calls. Wildcard line, Jamie in Cypress, Texas. Good morning, Jamie. What's on your mind?
Hi, James, but that's okay.
All right.
I'll make this quick on this. I'm in 55 now, but back in my youth when I was a child of late 60s, 70s, and 80s, I was a severely bullied child, not just with my local kids, but I mean even parents, teachers, and my mother. So I had some trauma growing up that I had to deal with. This, I believe, went into a lot of my dreams, and I had a series of dreams that involved what I described as a pair of tall, skinny men in suits that would basically chase me everywhere, and usually in a residential area. In the beginning of these dreams expanded over a 10-year period, and when they started, I would usually be chased by one or two pairs, and I would try to evade them. If I tried to run, I felt like I was running through molasses. One of my solutions was if I couldn't run straight, I'd hop, which allowed me to actually move faster and get away. Over that time frame, then there would be more of these shadow people that would be chasing me. At one point in a dream, I was cornered in between two buildings and with a tall fence, and I thought I would hop. Well, I hopped and actually hopped up so high that I kind of flew up in the stratosphere and then kind of fell, which I woke up because of the falling point of the dream. Over time, when I realized I could do that, I started turning those hops into controlled falls, and those controlled falls into glides, and those glides into flying. And eventually I got to a point when I was in high school that I stopped having the dreams about the shadow people, but I was able to fly in my dreams. And, if I wanted to go somewhere and I didn't like where I was at, I'd just fly away and go somewhere else.
Hey, James, so that's a lot to chew on right there. Let's let Jason try to tackle what you've shared with us so far. Jason?
What I'm seeing first is I really love that you found a response in your dreams that helped you to escape from the thing that was causing you fear. That is sort of empowerment is really important. When you do dream-based therapy, especially with nightmares, one of the techniques we use is called dream reentry. And it's an imaginative technique where you try to make the dream work out in some way better than where it ended. Oftentimes when the nightmare ends is like, here comes the serial killer, or the shadow people are creeping up on you and closing in, and, then you wake up and you're crying or screaming or just scared out of your mind. If you can come to some kind of response that can make that work out better, end better, then it's the first step towards healing. And if you can do it while you're in a dream, as opposed to using like a dream reentry technique, now you can really make some progress. Because what you're doing with the dream imagery is using it as an interface into the deep inner parts of yourself. And when you found a creative solution to the problem in the dream, you're actually looking deep inside of yourself for a solution to the problem that you were having. I do want to say one other thing. There are a lot of people who are in the same boat as you who have experienced chronic bullying, and they dream about it for sometimes even when they're far removed from the environment where that happened, they will keep dreaming about it because usually this is what I find as the source. They're still chained to the experience. They're traumatized by it, and it continues to hold them down inside. And what I'm seeing when you're bouncing up and kind of out into the atmosphere is it looked to me like you found a way of escaping from that morass of bad feelings, and what it can do to your self-image and stuff can be just terrible. But it sounds to me, and I don't want to presume too much, but based on the dream content, it sounds to me like you found a way of, shall we say, rising above it. The dream imagery is giving you a sort of a metaphor to describe some kind of internal process. And when you kind of rise up into the air, what I'm seeing as the possibility that it's a metaphor for rising above the situation that you're in. So
James,
I hope that's the case.
James, thanks for sharing. We're going to John, who is trucking in Ohio. Be careful out there, John. How you doing? Good morning.
Good, guys. Thanks. I got two. The first one was when I was a kid, and I would wake up, and we lived in a 2-story house, and I would go down to the steps to go to the bathroom. As I go down the steps, there's this monster blocking my path. And I go back to my bed, I pull the sheets over my head, and next thing I know, daytime's there, and nothing's, everything's okay. Years later, I'm watching the sci-fi show, The Silent Earth, and that alien with the claws and everything, that's the one that was in my dream. So then I have another one as I get older, and I'm in my 20s, and I'm in this room, and it's bright. And I don't know if it's these beings or what. And I ask what they're doing, and they say they're examining me. And at first I'm terrified and very scared. But they're saying, no, it ain't going to hurt. And then I ask them to enhance me, make me better, stronger, so I don't get sick and everything. Then I wake up. And those are the dreams I had as a kid. Lately now I get the ones where I go somewhere and there's people being shot at, and I'm running away. And I always seem to be one step ahead of the person with the gun, but then I get myself cornered in a room. And I take my belt off, and I put it up around the hinge, and they're just pushing on the door, trying to get in. And just as the door breaks open, I wake up in a cold sweat.
All right, John,
sounds like something is trying to get your attention. Oftentimes the thing that's like an intruder coming into your space that's trying to break down the door to get to you is something about yourself that feels like it's been disowned or alienated, or it's some kind of a realization that is trying to get to you, something coming up out of your subconscious mind. If you could face whatever it is and it does come through the door, you might find that it's not what it seems to be. It's just to give an example, some event happens in your childhood that makes a part of you kind of recede, like it gets split off from the main personality. So now here it is many years later, and that part of you is not, it's been so long since you've had any conscious contact with it that it can seem like it's almost alien to you. It's so disconnected from who you are now, presently, but it really is an aspect of yourself. Robert Moss wrote a book called Dreaming the Soul Back Home, and I would recommend that for anyone who feels like there's a part of themselves that's been lost in the past, because he'll teach you how to retrieve it, and there are dream techniques for doing this. This gives me an opportunity, that young childhood event you had where you saw the thing that popped up later, the alien. We've been talking a lot about the metaphors and symbolism of it and stuff, but George, I wanted to validate for people that people really do have experiences with these things where they they've dreamed about having a surgery, from these aliens, and it turned out that their cancer goes into remission, or some disease or condition that they'd had is mysteriously fixed. And we can't say for sure whether it was, an actual, like the aliens are helping me, kind of thing. Or if that's just the imagery that your mind wrapped around a process that was going on that seemed very alien or foreign to you at the time. But I want to just validate for the listeners out there that I wrote this book because I ran across too many of you whose stories were too compelling for me to be able to just put it all into the sort of traditional box of dream interpretation and say, well, there's something emotional going on here. This is some kind of metaphor, like they say, no, what I experienced was, like in your case, you actually ran across the image of that alien, that thing that you saw in your dream. You ran across it years later. In the first episode of The Dreams That Shape Us, the podcast that I do with my friend, season 1, episode 1, we interviewed a guy who was dreaming about a television show before he even knew that it existed. And then for a month, he would wake up from his dreams, he would watch the show, and then find out that he was dreaming about what he was going to watch from the eyes of the characters in the show. And it involved settings and actions and all kinds of things that was way too much overlap for it to be coincidental. So I do want to validate that experience for people out there who know that what they experienced was something that was not a conventional type of experience. And I think that might have been, in your case, because of the precognitive aspect of it. Sometimes the memory can kind of fool you a little by making you think that what you dreamed about was what you saw later in life. But I know of too many cases where it was not a slip of the memory. It was not, anything like that. It was actually dreaming about things that were going to happen later in their life, sometimes years ahead of time.
That's a great point. Thanks for that call, John. We go to Greg in Lafayette, Colorado. Hey, Greg, good morning. You're on with J.M. DeBord.
Hi, George and Jason.
Howdy.
Hi, Greg.
Hey, I just go right to it, and if I can I wrote it down real quick. I'm not able to sleep at night for some time, but I will then sleep most of the day, which makes life difficult. I had a dream recently of being held underwater in a small space. So my subconscious is trying to tell me something.
It could be trying to keep you asleep. Now, this is one possibility because I've seen this a number of times where being above water means being awake and conscious, and being under the water means being asleep and unconscious. The dreaming mind can go to great lengths if you, especially for people who wake up a lot and they don't really get that sort of deep, continuous sleep that they need. The dreaming mind will create all kinds of ways of keeping you dreaming, including the experience of dreams within dreams, but also that experience of feeling like you're being held down so there's one possibility of feeling like you're being held down underwater while dreaming is the experience of your dreaming mind trying to keep you from going above water, meaning trying to keep you from waking up. But there's also just a general look at that and simplify the idea that there is something holding you down, and start there. One of the techniques I teach in my Dreams 1, 2, 3 process of dream interpretation is to simplify the dream content so that you can step back from a lot of that drama and action and the strong feelings it brings up and see it for what it really is. It can be, that experience of being held down underwater is very frightening. But if you step back from it, you might see that, there is a feeling in me of feeling like I'm being held down, that perhaps like water is associated with emotion. It's very commonly in dreams a symbol for something related to emotions. So if you're being held down underwater, there might be something of like feeling like you can't get above what you're feeling to be able to understand what it really is. Instead, you're being held down in it in the sense of the emotions are really powerful and overwhelming. So that's one possibility to consider, but start with the simple idea, what is holding you down? That's where I would go with it, George. Do you have any ideas?
Now, that was pretty good. Greg, thanks for the call. Try to get one more in. East of the Rockies, Joe in Long Island. Hey, Joe, good morning. What's on your mind?
Hi, Jason. First of all, I wanted to get the name of your podcast, but when you see a stranger in a dream, sometimes you can note that you have an affiliation with the stranger, that you're trying to be sporty, you meet a sporty stranger. What would you say about the stranger that's more prominent in a dream, the meaning of the stranger?
Well, the first thing I would look at is, what is something that seems strange to me? Is there somebody who's come into my life recently who I'm trying to get to know and they're still sort of a stranger? But with most dream imagery, you want to ask the question of, what are you seeing about yourself in it, especially dream characters? So, I mean, a stranger, I would begin with ideas like, is there some aspect of myself that seems strange to me? Strange in the sense of being like unknown or mysterious. And then I would start to try to pull that imagery into my waking state and see if I can make a connection with what that is. Like, picture the face of the stranger and keep asking yourself, what is it about me that I'm seeing in it? And by the way, thank you for asking about the podcast. The Dreams That Shape Us is the name of the podcast. And if you go to dreams.reddit.com, right now at the top of the front page, I put a welcome post for all the Coast to Coast listeners. So if there's any links they want towards like my podcast or my book, or they just want to drop by to say hi, drop by there. Actually, while we were on break, I had a listener to the show drop by and they made a comment. So I would love to see more of them. So dreams.reddit.com, look to the top of the front page and you'll see a post there that's welcoming the Coast to Coast listeners.
Great.
Great. Yeah,
I think we're putting some links on our website too, so people can find you. I don't think we have enough time to take another call. Just say, Jason, I'm really impressed by the book and the conversation we've had. I've learned so much, and I can imagine you've helped a lot of people who are, in essence, terrorized by recurring dreams that just scare the heck out of them.
And I tried to put as much of that information into the book as I could and make it accessible for people, breaking it down by topic so that they can look things up very quickly if they have a specific symbol or situation in their dreams. And then there's also an index in the back. This, my experience of this, George, led me to want to write this book, and it all came together in a way that was very synchronous. There was a meaningfulness to it. And I poured my heart into that thing. I took a year to write that book and just give all of the information and knowledge that I could share about the subject of nightmares and dream interpretation, with the hope that people will be able to use my book and it will help them to at least get started finding the solutions that they need so that their nightmares will go away. Because, George, do you know how do you take care of nightmares and make them go away? You get the message. It's been shown through study after study. Get the message, the nightmares go away. But that's not so easy for people who don't have a background in dream interpretation. I'm used to teaching people who don't have the degrees and they don't have the background in the psychology of dreams and nightmares and stuff like that. I've studied all that stuff, but I understand that there's kind of a gap between, where people approach this subject from kind of a layman's perspective. I wanted to be able to write a book that would be able to reach them specifically, but also be valuable for people who might also have a
Well, it's good. It's definitely good, and you're welcome back here anytime. J.M. DeBord, Jason DeBord, thanks for being here. Appreciate it.
Been a pleasure, George. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks also to my earlier guest, the great John Fogerty, and to my colleagues there at Coast to Coast, Michael Cosio and Donna Walker, Ryan Stacy, Dan Kalani, Chris Boros, George Norrie and Tom Danheiser, and Lisa Lyon, of course. I'm George Knapp. I'll be back in a couple of weeks, everyone. Good night.